Thank you, Sue, and thank all who organized this and each of you for coming as well. It shows how important these issues really are. And I also want to thank Treva for her great assistance in putting this together. Treva and I have both worked for the Nooksack tribe close to 19 years. So we've been comrades in arms for quite a while now. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the importance of salmon at first. There's the economic importance, and Pete touched on some of that this morning. It's an incredibly delicious and healthy, protein-rich food source as well. And it's important for recreation, for both saltwater recreation like fishing in the San Juan Islands, which our fisheries contribute to, as well as freshwater, sport angling as well. It's really important culturally for the two tribes who salmon is, I can't overstate the importance of salmon really to them. And then for the last one is for the ecosystem. Salmon are a way of bringing the marine-derived nutrients back, and there are so many both terrestrial species and both plants and animals and aquatic species that are highly dependent on those nutrients coming back into our watersheds. So we don't have absolute historical catch numbers, but we have the best source that I found is 1895 U.S. Fish Commissioner report on fisheries. I think it's 96 or 97 report, but it's describing the 1895 catch numbers for fisheries of the west coast of the U.S. In it, the fisheries in Puget Sound were just developing and rapidly taking off, and Nooksack was a particular interest in me. So these are in millions of pounds that were sold to the canneries or the fresh fish market. So that's 5.1 million pounds for Point Roberts, and about 90% of that was sockeye, so those would be Fraser River fish. But the 1.1 million pounds from Bellingham and Chuckanut Bays, a good portion of that would be expected to be Nooksack fish, although probably not 100%. But the Nooksack River had almost 2 million pounds, I think it was 1.997 million pounds of Chinook, coho, and steelhead. Those were the three species that were sold either to the local canneries or down to the fresh fish market, which I think was basically out of Seattle. But if you took, so it was described in pounds, and if I translated those pounds and assumed a 22-pound average for Chinook, it was 22,500 Chinook that came out of the Nooksack main stem in 1895 that went to that market of the canneries or the fresh fish market. At a 12-pound average, it would be 70,000 coho and 55,000 steelhead. And it was really the steelhead number that most astounded me. The coho I could understand given the large wetlands that have been described earlier today in the lowlands. But that really showed me the capacity, the historic capacity of our basin, even though it doesn't include the fish that we allowed to spawn, that created the next generation and generations after that of these species. Doesn't include the tribal catch, doesn't include the settler catch, and this 2 million pounds doesn't include the marine catches either. So it gives you some idea of what those were. And then by comparison to today, instead of tens of thousands of Chinook, for our two Nooksack early Chinook populations, and those are the only populations we have, we are down in the basically 100 to less than 600 wild fish in those two populations rolled together. So it just kind of paints how much decline we've had for that. And so these are, the recent years, and they bounce up and down a little bit, but you can see that it's not very encouraging, and you can't see clear trends in there, even with population rebuilding programs that we've got. With Nooksack Steelhead, we're at 1,500 to 2,000 roughly for the wild abundances for our Nooksack winter runs. There is a native summer run that goes up the South Fork, but we don't have abundance estimates for that. But at least these numbers are pretty stable. But again, they're 1,500 to 2,000 instead of, upper tens of thousands of fish as we had. For other species, we don't, the coho, I've kind of described what their historic numbers were. Today, we don't have formal estimates, but it's a few thousand fish that spawn in the wild, and that would be a mixed composition of both hatchery origin and wild would be in that. Chum salmon, we're at least stable as compared to the basins to the south of us. We have tens of thousands of chum per year, and are also, because it's a relatively healthy run, have been able to harvest tens of thousands additional to that, and the runs have held up. But everything to the south of us, like Samish, Skagit, Stilly, Snohomish systems, they are not doing well for chum, and we're not quite sure why. Skagit hasn't had a chum fishery since 2008, so we should appreciate what we've got up here at a minimum. For pink salmon, the last cycle we had about 250,000. It was one of our stronger runs. This year's going to be much weaker, and it probably just relates to the high flow events that we had in the incubation period. Pinks, are highly dependent on that. So habitat is really a key factor in this decline. And, we've done various things with land use, and we've got categories here, but it's basically all of us. To one extent or another, all of us are, in over the last 150 years, have been affecting this, sustainable resource, partially by not understanding it and just having other needs, basically. But land use has led to habitat degradation, and I'll get into each of the factors listed on the right a little bit more in upcoming slides. But those are some of the major ways that land use affects the fish, or the water quality and quantity of the fish. So when you lose your streamside forest, it's really hard to overstate the importance of large woody debris in streams for salmon. It breaks up your hydraulic energy so that you've got less scour of the eggs in the gravel, provides hiding cover for fish. The log jams, create deep pools with cover, which are pools are holding preference areas for almost all salmon, basically, and rearing. They're just, and if you lose your wood, you tend to lose that. Trees provide shade, they provide leaf litter and terrestrial insects, basically food supply, and provide bank stability. Your channel migration rates tend to increase once you've lost your forests adjacent to the river. With floodplain disconnection, we've got both bank hardening, so that would be riprap, and then we've got levees, which are areas where we've used riprap. Usually it's riprap, it can be earth as well, to raise the banks of the river above the floodplain. And both of these, basically the riprap itself is not preferred rearing habitat for fish. So the hardening simplifies the habitat. Both of these greatly reduce your wood recruitment because you've cut off a lot of your historic wood recruitment area by locking the channel into these areas. You can cause channel incision as well by both of these, and particularly with levees, by having faster velocities since the river can't spill out to its floodplains anymore. And similarly, you get overbank deposit of fine sediment that's coming down the system from higher in the watershed. You can reduce that by building your levees. It keeps those overbank deposits from happening, and then the sediment just continues down to the estuary, basically, where it ultimately ends up. With culverts and other barriers, culverts cross all jurisdictions, and a lot of work has been done on culverts, and a lot of other work still needs to be done. But they block passage to habitat, which reduces, the quantity of habitat that we have, as do dams. The major dam that we've got is the diversion dam on the Middle Fork, which blocks a good bit of that habitat. There has been progress made on those, and there will be, we continue to need to make more progress on them. But particularly with culverts, I would say it's coho and steelhead that are most affected by that. With wetland loss, it's coho that really get hit by that in a great way because they prefer wetland areas for rearing in the winter. Places like beaver ponds are highly functional coho overwintering habitats. But the wetlands, when we lose those, we're not storing our our precipitation events well, so it reduces our base flows in the summer by losing those wetlands. And it can increase our winter peak flows as well, because we're not storing those floodwaters. We're basically just expediting it off the surface of the land. And then wetlands can also filter pollutants quite a bit, and so we lose kind of a filtering and water quality benefit from them as well. In-stream flows, there's a lot of ways those, if you think about it for fish, the quantity of habitat you've got relates to the in-stream flows, because that's what these fish live in, is water. Then additionally, you can have passage issues, for fish to be able to get up into habitats. So we're seeing that this year with pink salmon. They're really not, the flows have been so low, they haven't been able to get into the tributaries that are at least some of our index areas for doing those. And then, temperature, you get a temperature response. The less water you've got, the more quickly it can heat up. And basically, if you drop in-stream flows quickly, you can also you can dewater and leave fish on the bar. But I wouldn't expect that to be happening a great deal of the time with permitted withdrawals, basically. So degraded water quality, you've got temperature impacts, and I'll show an example of that in a minute, and then turbidity or suspended sediment impacts. And the turbidity and sediment is probably, it's a combination of land use on naturally unstable areas, which can, increase the frequency that you have the landslides. And then we've got more turbidity from climate change. Basically, as the glaciers are receding, we have a lot of unconsolidated sediments that can get mobilized in the summer. So in the summer, in our glacial forks, we tend to see higher turbidity events, and particularly on hot spells. Contaminants in general, and it's coho in particular who get hit by those in urban settings. You hear a lot about that in Seattle streams and whatnot. So with climate change, this is a picture of a South Fork Nooksack spring Chinook that my crew took last week. This fish, this female died, so she's a pre-spawn mortality. And you probably can't see it too well, but kind of near the index finger on the gloved hand below it, you see a little yellowish area, and that's columnaris. And that's a temperature-related disease that we're losing some of our adult Chinook to and pink salmon on hot years. It takes off when the temperatures are suboptimal, being too high for fish, and we're losing fish basically right before they spawn. But climate change in general, it's already been spoken about, increases the winter peak flows, so you've got potentially more scour and flushing of juveniles, reduces summer flows, increases temperatures, and the increased sediment load. With fisheries harvest, when you've got healthy habitat, populations have harvestable surpluses. And so population productivity is a concept I need to explain for harvest, and that is the number of fish you produce per pair of fish that spawn is a good way to think of that. So as your habitat declines, the number of fish that you produce declines with it. You just have lower survival rates as that habitat goes down. So as your productivity goes down in response to habitat changes, your formerly sustainable harvest rates are no longer sustainable. And so there's the request for harvest to cut back, but what really is changing, the underpinnings are the productivity which relates to habitat, or things like marine survival. We've seen great decrease in marine survival in the last 20 to 30 years from either prey-based changes or predation impacts. But the goal for harvest is to not impede recovery. And there are many preseason planning forums where we go through that, particularly for Chinook. But for the Nooksack Chinook populations, most of the harvest is in Canada. There's some in Alaska. Alaska is somewhat similar to what we take down in the southern United States. But harvest alone, you can shut off harvest and you're not going to recover these fish. Because the underpinnings of the problems are habitat. In fact, we're to the point now where with our Chinook populations that National Marine Fisheries Service has done a recent assessment, and because by their assessment, our populations are not replacing themselves from a wild fish to wild fish perspective. They basically think that you might go extinct with zero harvest anywhere Alaska south. It's getting to that point. We just can't do that much more for harvest to save these runs because so much cutback. Steelhead's a really good example of that, where we have almost no harvest at all on steelhead, but they're still not really recovering appreciably. With hatcheries, you can have a number of goals with hatcheries. One of the primary ones is to create fish for harvest to basically mitigate for the loss of the habitat that used to be productive. You can use it for harvest monitoring, which we do from the Kindle program, putting coat of wire tags on our spring Chinook to estimate the rates. You can have education, like Whatcom Creek Hatchery does, and population rebuilding programs. So both of our two Nooksack spring Chinook populations have population rebuilding programs, which can reduce the short-term risk of extinction, and I very much believe that they do. But really, they're sort of buying us time until we fix the habitat so that we can get our population productivity back. With hatcheries, there are a number of ways that hatcheries can and have affected salmon. And so I think it's not that different from like forestry. You need to think about legacy impacts of things that we've done in the past where we either didn't understand things or now we know better versus current concerns with current practices. And those are things that I think are important to keep as you're thinking across the H's really. So a legacy effect of hatcheries would be like no longer having native fall Chinook in the Nooksack where we have fall Chinook that look like Green River Chinook from long transplants that we've done here. And then we have hatchery and genetic management plans for each anadromous fish program in our area, which are how they describe how these programs are run and how they're going to minimize impacts on wild fish. So you've got land use regulations and you've got stewardship and you've got acquisition for habitat protection. And I want to talk a little bit about the stewardship because land use, it kicks in, but it's imperfect because you can only do so much. And some of this is population growth. And people, they want to see the river. So land use gets triggered when someone applies for a permit. But we really need better stewardship. By landowners so that we individually make better decisions to do that. And habitat restoration can help us a great deal with restoring habitat for recovery. You've got Instream restoration, like our log jams, to address immediate deficiencies that are impacting the population. And then culverts, riparian restoration, where you're restoring the processes, and floodplain reconnection, wetlands, and estuary and nearshore. That's it.
This is a question regarding, I know that there's a propensity to look at fecal coliform as a water quality indicator. However, agricultural things change in most areas, and we see a proliferation of berry farms. To me, that's like a sugar cube of pesticide concentration. And I have a background in persistence of toxic chemicals in the environment. So in the future, do you have a consideration of that biomagnification, which would probably be in the fish, in the lipids of the fish? Are you looking at that as a water quality, as the persistence or the biomagnification in the salmon? You can still have salmon swimming, but they can be awfully sick, and they can transmit that up the chain.
I know there's work that's being done, and Alan might know a little better about this than I do, but I think there's work that's, and I don't know what the results are, but I think there's work that's recently been done taking salmon smolts that have come out from the smolt trap in the lower Nooksack River and doing contaminant analysis on those fish. I know from the Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference that there's a lot of work that's being done in like estuaries and Puget Sound level on contaminants, and they're increasingly realizing, for example, with Chinook salmon, that they're seeing concentrations that will affect these fish in certain places anyway, and so they're trying to better understand what those loads are. So I don't know that any of our
I can speak a little bit.
jurisdictions are, but some of that work is happening.
And that would extend. Thank you.